Saturn SHIRO.
It's now been decades since the Saturn's first Christmas in the West. It was then that Sega unleashed 3 of their biggest arcade hits onto the Saturn. But were we ready for the future? Welcome to SEGA Saturn SHIRO, the only podcast that still parties like it's 1995.
Hello folks, welcome to SEGA Saturn SHIRO. So, it's been a little while since we've recorded a mainline podcast, and I just want to talk about that a little bit. You know, with the success of the SHIRO show with Pat and Dave every Friday, as well as the Editor's Corner minicast that Dave and I do, you know, everyone's been really busy producing content, and we haven't really kept up with our podcast. But we felt that the podcast was a really good thing to do. It's not something that we want to see go away. And so it just felt like the right time to reboot it. Think of it as a sort of ABC start combination, if you will. So the topic for this evening is the big 3 of 1995. And so I'm talking about Virtua Cop, SEGA Rally, and Virtua Fighter 2. We'll discuss the games themselves, their impact on the Saturn's fortunes, and their significance in the Saturn's story. Tonight's Shiros are Nick, Ben, and myself, Peter. As per usual, we'll start with some personal updates. Nick, what have you been up to lately?
You know, been up to work, and other than that, been working on 3 episodes of the Pandemonium Review series kind of simultaneously, and still getting a lot of source material for all of them, especially the Double Switch episode. That one's taking a lot of unexpected turns. We'll leave it at that for now. Yeah, that one's going bananas.
Nice.
Yep, and of course the Sega Rally one, very excited about. By the time this podcast is done, I'll probably be either close to or have finished the video about the Sega Extreme contest entries, which it's another very exciting year for Saturn homebrew. Other than that, yeah, just busy with work and still trying to keep up on the benchmark of engineering excellence as best I can.
Well said. What about you, Ben? What have you been up to?
Well, I've had my fair share of work going all over the country so far, ever since we last spoke. And on the gaming side of things, I've started to put together basically like a game nights at my house where we'll basically have some friends over and play some multiplayer games. And everybody's really excited to do the 10-player Bomberman. That's one of the big ones that I keep telling people that I'm going to have set up, and we're going to jam into that, and they have no idea what's coming. It's so much fun to do. And so we've got a big screen at my house, and my girlfriend Megan is all supportive of this because me and her have done our fair share of some Bomberman, and so even she just shows me in my place on this thing sometimes. She's gotten really good at it, and so she's looking forward to that. I am, and yeah, that's the big thing that I've been doing here recently. It was something that I wanted to do right before COVID happened. And then once that came in, it really, obviously affected that. But we're finally at the point where we feel comfortable being able to do that. And we're definitely looking forward to having it in full swing. Nice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with COVID, the impacts were so huge. And I think we really missed out on those sort of experiences where folks can get together to play games. I mean, yes, of course, there's online gaming, but there's something really cool about just getting a couple of folks together in one room and just, having a blast that way. So good on you. Like, that's fantastic.
Yeah, we are very much big couch co-op people. We love playing something that you can play in a room with other people, and you can push people around, yell at them, in fun ways, obviously. But those type of games are the stuff that we just love, and we love it when new games come out that support that.
So let me ask you, have you ever, in a fit of rage, cut somebody's controller cable?
No, but what we so you have to hold on to your controller when you're playing at my house, because what we'll end up doing though is we'll trip the cord accidentally. Oh, your controller came out of your hand. Oh, I am so sorry.
Nice.
Classic.
Very nice. Okay. Very much approving. Yeah, and then just a bit of an update from my side. To be honest, I've been playing a lot of nights. That's just something that I seem to weave in and out of, and it's a comfort blanket for me. It's a game that I can just jump into. It's great. It makes me feel good and happy, and yeah, life is good. And then beyond that, gaming wise, I've actually been really kind of getting into all the mini consoles that I've got. So most of the main ones that have come out, I've picked up over the years, and I don't want them just to be ornament pieces or anything like that. And so I've really been kind of diving into them. All the Retrobit controllers, the USB dongles, they work with the Sega ones at least anyways. So it's really cool to just be able to, have that mini console sort of by the TV and just to be able to, sit as far away as you want and, untethered, be able to play some of those classic games. So that's kind of been what I've been up to. More of, some of the Sega mini consoles than anything else, but, they're all good. So it's been a lot of fun.
Oh, absolutely. Those mini consoles are fantastic. And if you are able to get your hands on one and really play some of those games, it's a real easy and good way to do it, especially with the HDMI output. It hooks it right up into a regular TV.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? I'll say this. It's a way for me to collect, if you will, some of the Sony and Nintendo games without having a physical collection. I'm really trying to kind of make sure that my collection doesn't take over too much space in my house. So, if I can slam a whole bunch of classic games into one, mini console, then that works out just fine for me. Okay, so let's dive into our main topic for this cast. So I'm going to set a little bit of the context. So we're now approaching the end of 1995. Both the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn have been on the market in North America for a solid few months. But Sony's really been kind of pulling away and just giving Sega a thumping in the court of public opinion. So the games that Sony has been pumping out have been much better received by the general gaming population. And, more worryingly, I recall this from the time, folks had really started doubting the power of the Saturn. They felt that the Saturn, and this was all over the press at the time, that the Saturn just could not keep up with the PlayStation at all. They weren't even in the same league. And at this time, keep in mind, this is, before the Nintendo 64 dropped as well. So Sega found themselves in a bit of a perilous situation where they really kind of needed to prove to folks out there that the Saturn, is all that and it can keep up. And in fact, it can, produce world-class gaming experiences and it could beat the best of what Sony could offer. And so that was sort of the situation that they found themselves in. But they did have an ace up their sleeve, really, at the end of the day, and that was their arcade presence and their arcade heritage. They had a huge back catalog of arcade games, and they were really, sort of the leading-edge arcade makers at the time. And that's something that neither Sony or Nintendo, for that matter, could lay claim to. And so it was from this catalog of arcade hits that they would pull out what would later be known as the Big Three of 1995, and I'm talking about Virtua Cop, SEGA Rally Championship, and Virtua Fighter 2. So all three of these titles hit in November to December of 95, and so they hit right in time for the Christmas season. And I want us to just sort of talk through a little bit how they were received, what we all think of the games, and just sort of, the impact that they had on the situation overall. So we will start with the first title released, and that is Virtua Cop. So, I'm sure all three of us have played Virtua Cop. Nick, you've played it, I'm sure, extensively in the last little while.
I've dabbled.
You put out a pretty massive documentary on the game, and we'll leave a link in the description. But this is a documentary that everybody who loves the Saturn and who loves Sega arcade games really needs to go and watch. It is absolutely worth it. Lots of original material in there. There's some really cool things that I found out about Virtua Cop that's in that video. So if you guys haven't watched it, I highly encourage you to watch Nick, aka Pandemonium's fantastic Virtua Cop review / documentary. And as I said, the link will be in the description. But let's dive into Virtua Cop on the Sega Saturn. I'm curious, did either of you play this game in the arcades or even on the Saturn, around the time that it was current?
I was about 1 or 2 years old, so no.
That would be a negative.
I absolutely did play this on the Saturn and in the arcades. This was something I was very familiar with, and I was very looking forward to it releasing.
Nice. Okay, so it was the first of the big three to come out, and it came out, you could either buy it separately as just the game, or you could buy it as the game and the Stunner light gun, or Virtua Gun as it's known in other parts of the world. So did you play it with a controller? Did you play it with the light gun? How did you approach Virtua Cop on the Saturn?
Well, for me, it was definitely with the light gun. It was like the only way to play it. When it came out that way and we had the light guns available, it was just awesome. And I really thought it was the greatest thing to be able to do that because I had gotten used to seeing it at the arcade. And of course, at the arcade, you're using the light gun there. And so being able to have that experience at home was just amazing.
Yeah, and so obviously light guns had been around for long before Virtua Cop. But this was really the first polygonal light gun game where different parts of the character models were sensitive to shots. So, in previous sprite shooters, if you shot a bad guy, you shot him and they would have their sort of dying animation. That was that. But here in Virtua Cop, where on the bad guy's body you shot made a difference in how they reacted, how many points you got, etc. So, it was actually really novel. It got a lot of attention in the arcades and even in the gaming press of the time, because even though it was not necessarily a new genre of gaming, it was a really fresh take on how to do a light gun game. And the arcade game was, it was awesome. It was amazing. But boy, when it came home on the Saturn, it was so good. They did such a nice job with it. And I'll turn to you, Nick. So, obviously you were 1 or 2 when it came out, but you've obviously played it since. And so, what were your impressions of Virtua Cop?
You mean when I first played it, ever?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah. So I got into Saturn collecting right around high school, and this would be about 2010 when I got a Saturn, and Virtua Cop was one of the first games I played through a Saturn mouse. It was by way of a Saturn mouse because I didn't have any tube TVs at home. But this buddy of mine, Isaac, who lived not too far down the street, had a tube TV that his Wii was hooked up to in his gaming attic, and me and a few other friends would frequently have gaming sleepovers there. And they'd always ask me to bring Virtua Cop because we could use the guns. And we wound up playing Virtua Cop with the guns more than the Wii. And remember, at the time, the Wii was in vogue. That was one of the consoles to play. Brawl, Super Smash Brothers Brawl just came out, and we were putting more time into Virtua Cop. It's through 2-player, and this was just the first Virtua Cop game. So a lot of fun memories playing that cooperatively. I had a buddy named Tony who would always say, "Oh, I'm doing the Tony 2-tap," where he'd always, shoot the bad guys twice. None of us knew that you had to shoot them 3 times to maximize your points, but why would that matter, right? It was great. A lot of late nights spent playing Virtua Cop over at Isaac's attic, and then I just played it at home quite a lot too, just in my spare time.
Were there 2 guns when you guys were playing in the attic?
Yep, a Sega Stunner and I think it's the Pursuer, one of the third-party ones. It worked. Both of them worked really well.
Nice.
Oh, you were so lucky. We didn't have the 2 guns when I was growing up. We had to switch back and forth between who's playing the gun, and it's their turn to play, and here we go.
Yep. If you had the gun, you were doing better, for sure.
See, and that's so weird. I didn't play the game with a gun for a long time because initially I just rented the game several times. And unfortunately, it was disc only as a rental. So I had to sort of make do with, the cursor on screen and a controller. So I didn't even have a Saturn mouse at the time to be able to play that way. And so, like when you're playing with the controller, you assign, a shooting button, a reload button, which you have to click twice, I think. And then you can also assign a third button to your controller for essentially speed. So if you hold this button down, then your cursor will zoom around on the screen a lot faster than if you're not holding the that speed up button. And so I assigned it to one of the two like shift keys on the Saturn controller. And then that way I could, keep it held down the entire time I played. And then, just use two buttons for shooting and reload while I kind of zoomed around with a controller. So, it wasn't ideal. Obviously, it's not nearly as good of an experience without the gun. And I did eventually, get a gun and was able to enjoy the game with a gun. And it's, loads better with a gun. If you're going to enjoy Virtua Cop and you've got access to a gun and an old CRT or tube TV, then, the gun is the way to go. And just to give an example, like especially if you've got bad guys showing up in opposite corners of the screen, you just can't quite, that cursor just isn't fast enough to move on a controller to be able to get them without you taking damage. So it does kind of make it a little bit tougher. But yeah, so I enjoyed the game. I thought it was just a really well done game. But so I admit I had one negative sort of first impression about the game, and it was simply that as an arcade conversion, it was great, but it was pretty short. I mean, you went through your 3 levels, and then the game was done, right? And so I think at the time, gamers were really sort of clamoring for much longer games, more involved games. They wanted a game to last, 50, 60, 70 hours or whatever, whereas Virtua Cop, would be done way shorter than that. And so I'm curious, whether you guys kind of feel the same way about it, or do you just enjoy it for what it is?
So first, I'm going to take a moment to tell everybody that doesn't know, because I always like to announce this. If you don't know, you can take apart the Saturn light gun, and there's 2 spots for AA batteries, so that it's got a little bit more weight and it feels a little better when you're using it. So this was something that we've brought out and we've shown people before, but I wanted to reiterate that now that we're talking about a light gun game. If you forgot and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot you can do that. It's totally cool. It makes it feel much better, more hefty, I guess you could say, but it's definitely something you can do.
It's got a better weight to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And some people say put both batteries. Some people say just put one. I like the option that you can do one or both and just kind of get a good feel for what you like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's something that you kind of discovered as well, Nick, during your documentary, isn't it?
Yeah, we kind of all discovered it at the same time by way of our group interview with Kenji Tosaki over a Facebook comment thread, which was kind of a fun venue for that. But he designed the peripheral and told us he believes a 1 battery in the handle and no battery in the grip is optimal. But yeah, like Ben said, find your preference. Everybody's going to have their own preference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, going back to Peter's question about how we felt about the short stages, when I was younger and I was a kid and we were playing these games, what we were really loving more than anything was having that arcade experience at home. And so when we had these games that we were familiar with that you could play at the arcade, which, arcade games typically aren't going to last you more than an hour or, a long period of time. Having them at home, we just totally were fine with the fact that, oh, hey, it's 3 to 4 to 5 or whatever stages. That's it. We play the game over and over and over again. And we did. And we loved it. And it never really was a big issue that there was just 3 stages. It never really was a big problem with us. Now, looking at it nowadays, when companies are making video games that are an arcade version, but for the home edition, you'll usually find them, they add on a level, they add on a stage or more features or things that make the game longer inherently in that sense. But back then, back when the Saturn was doing this, it wasn't a problem. We didn't worry about it. We loved it regardless.
Yeah, to be honest, it took me a while, and I think this will lead into something that that Nick can talk about, but it took me a while to sort of get used to the scoring system. Like I initially just kind of blasted through it. I put it on the easiest difficulty. I gave myself the most credits you can. I, gave myself the biggest sort of gun, target radius that I could. And, I kind of worked my way through the game. And when it was done, it was like, okay, that was good. That was fun, but I want more. And it wasn't until later that I kind of really started paying attention to the brilliant scoring system, and that really kind of hooked you in the way that I think that Sega games hooked people in those days, because then it became not just you got to get to the finish line, but you were almost competing against yourself to see how well you could score. Can you do better next time? And then of course other people's scores too. So and I know this is something that you kind of delved into pretty extensively, Nick. Do you want to just talk about the scoring a little bit?
Yeah, so basically it's a multiplier based scoring system. You get your set amount of points for, shooting a bad guy. There's the justice shot, which if you shoot the gun out of a bad guy's hand, that nets you more points. But the thing about the scoring system that really, really ticks, if you shoot a bad guy 3 times, then the amount of points you get from that is way higher than if you shoot him only once or twice. And the more you shoot bad dudes consecutively without getting hit, the higher your overall score multiplier goes up. There's a bar beneath your score, like a little yellow bar. And every time you shoot bad guys, it fills up. And it can go up to 1x, 2x, 3x, all the way up to, if memory serves correct, it's been a bit since I've looked into this and played it a lot, but it goes up to 9 times. So, and if you get hit, and you lose a hit point, that multiplier goes down by 1 or 2. So if you burn through the first level without getting hit at all, by the end of it, you're shooting these bad guys 3 times, and that's getting multiplied by possibly 4 or 5 or 6, and you continue into level 2 without getting hit. You're eventually, all those points are being multiplied by 9. And if you are to continue to do that well without getting hit, your score is going to be just insanely thick. In the arcade game, they kind of did this. They kind of, it was sort of busted because the score could only go up to, I'm pretty sure it was 999,999, whatever, nines in a row, where it was like, okay, we can't do a bigger number than this. That's too many digits. That was fixed in the Saturn port, but yeah, if you had this in your arcade, there was probably the challenge to max out the score. And yeah, it was pretty much, I don't want to say busted, but you can get really, really dummy high scores in Virtua Cop by just, simply not getting hit, not shoot. And if you shoot a good guy, an innocent or a hostage, whatever you want to call them, that also decreases your multiplier. So
yeah, I was going to ask, because that was one thing that I kind of found annoying, but at the same time challenging and fun. Is so you've got these bad guys popping up all over the place, and then with as much intelligence as you can think, you've got these innocent people popping up in the line of fire.
Don't shoot me.
Don't shoot me. Yeah, and I would pop them off without thinking every single time. And I know you lose like one,
Yep.
one life when you do that.
Yeah,
So you obviously want to avoid it. I wasn't sure whether you lost points, but you've just confirmed. So that's, that's
you lose
another,
your multiplier. Yeah.
your
you don't,
multiplier.
lose
Thank you. Yes,
points,
the
but
multiplier.
yeah.
So yeah, like, I mean, and in later levels, like especially in that third stage where they're wearing like business attire and whatever, they blend in pretty well with with the bad guys, who are usually typically wearing suits, not in every section, but in a lot of sections. Like on that first level, those iconic docks, like, I mean, I think the innocents are primarily wearing like white overalls or whatever, like coveralls, right?
It's like an all white suit, basically.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, they're fairly easy to spot, I guess you could say, but yeah, as the game kind of progresses, it does get tougher. But okay, so I just want to quickly just find out, and I'll shoot this question over your way, Ben. So if you've played this game a lot at the arcades, how did you feel that the Saturn conversion held up?
Okay, so for me, for the Saturn conversion, back in the day, conversions a lot of times didn't look that great. I'm thinking about things like the Game Boy that got like a Mortal Kombat, or the Game Gear that had its version of arcade games, and you're missing features, and the quality is not the best. You can even go into things like Virtua Cop, or not Virtua Cop. I'm sorry, Virtua Racing. Where it had its many ports and all that good stuff, but that being said, I felt like the Saturn version of Virtua Cop held up really well. Yeah, sure, it was not quite right on board with the arcades, but it really was totally fine. It was fun, which was the biggest thing, and that really is what held it for me.
Yeah, and I mean, at the time, I know the game reviewed really, really well on Saturn, and like the light gun coming, packaged with the game, I think helped a lot, obviously because it's a light gun game, but the light gun was identical to what was, at the arcade cabinets. So, not only did the experience come home really well, visually and audio wise and so on, gameplay wise, but you also physically had the same hardware, which I thought was really, really cool. So, and it had a positive impact. Like it had a lot of really good press, in the gaming magazines of the time. And all of a sudden, okay, this was a conversion that, like you said, Ben, it was really well done. Because I'm thinking back to arcade conversions of the time. I mean, if it was a 2D game, say like a Mortal Kombat or whatever, then sprites were usually smaller on the home version, or it was less colors, or there were missing animations, or what have you. And even when you got to the Saturn and you stepped up to 32-bit gaming, your conversions of Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter 1, although the gameplay was all there, they were not stellar, from like a visual performance fidelity perspective. There were some challenges there. And yes, all of us diehard Saturn gamers are going to say, graphics don't matter as much as gameplay, and this is of course true. However, for the general gaming population that Sega was targeting, it did matter. And it mattered especially because when you compared it, against Sony's games at the time, they just looked better. They didn't necessarily play better, and in my opinion, many of them didn't, but they looked better. And so they were able to hook more of an audience. And so Virtua Cop coming across as well as it did, I thought, had, it made people, sit up and take notice. And I, just jumping back to your review documentary that you did, Nick, like what would you say were some of the, biggest surprises or sort of shocking moments or whatever that you learned as you were doing your research on Virtua Cop?
Right. And by many probably know by now, and if not, cat's out of the bag here, I had the privilege of speaking with 7 of the people who worked on the Saturn port of Virtua Cop, a couple of whom also did the arcade version. And this was with help of translator Sam I Am. I cannot credit and thank him enough for helping set that up. And he really did a ton of work behind the scenes to make sure that was able to happen at all. So I just really would like to give him a extremely grateful shout out here. Same guy is working on Princess Crown translation, and yes, he's still working on it. So this was the fact that the game turned out as well as it did. Should be considered an accomplishment. The team that did this game was inexperienced. Many of them were suddenly thrust into positions within Sega that they did not sign up for. One of them, Norihiro Sekine, was one of the main programmers, and he had never programmed, period, before working on Virtua Cop for the Sega Saturn. It was under the leadership of Takashi Isono and Hiroyuki Suzuki, partly under the leadership of 2 or 3 guys who actually knew what they were doing, for the rest of this team of about a dozen, most of whom had never done the role that they were doing before. All kind of shoved aside in this corner of Sega AM2. The impression was that Sega management knew this team was inexperienced. They wanted a port of Virtua Cop. They did not care how it turned out. All their Genesis operations were shut down. Sega Genesis Mega Drive operations were basically done. They were cut in favor of getting as much content either ported or developed for the Saturn as possible. And this was considered a unimportant side project of management.
Wow.
And it was at the Tokyo Toy Show that summer of 1995 that they had a demo of the first level that they showed off to the general public. This is really the first time the game in its playable form was shown, and the public was allowed to come by and play it. And that wowed everybody. This was really the first time that we were seeing 3D work well on Saturn from an arcade port. Like you said, Peter, Daytona, Virtua Fighter 1 played great. They didn't look good. People noticed that. People thought the Saturn can't do this. It's a 2D machine. It can barely do 3D at all. And the developers of Virtua Cop told us the same thing. They said, we're making a 3D game on a sprite machine. But they made it work. This was being developed alongside, in tangent with Sega Graphics Library, which is a 3D polygon engine designed for the Saturn. PlayStation already had a similar 3D engine that worked really well and was very easy to use, and they had that developed early on before the console came out, thanks to a very fortunate partnership Sony made with Psygnosis. And that gave them their 3D polygon engine before the console came out. It was a really luck of the draw thing for them. They played their business cards right. And Sega was, they hadn't done anything wrong. It's just that they didn't play as far ahead as Sony did. They were doing the same thing they'd always done, which was release the console now and give everybody manuals and ask questions later. That was the norm. So, that was kind of being developed alongside it, and Virtua Cop was using it. The thing that surprised me most, though, was how ragtag of a team this was. I could go on and on for hours about this. I went on for 4.5 hours about this game, but long story short is this was a ragtag group of developers, many of whom did not know what they were doing at first, that Sega basically set up to fail. And what wound up happening instead is they overcame and beat the odds, releasing this extremely well done port of Virtua Cop that wowed people and made people stop and think, all right, the Saturn can do 3D now. We are seeing 3D people move around. The environment's not dropping frame rate. It's, everything's looking good. Nothing's clipping out. The draw distance is not an issue. Like, this is sick. And it's on top of that really, really fun. It doesn't have the same polygon count as the arcade version, but the Saturn was able to do texture mapping in ways the Model 2 couldn't. And so many parts of the game looked better than the arcade version, like the sky, some other textures, the color fidelity, and the color amount. A lot of that was kind of them making it their own, using the textures to really put their own artistry into it. Stuff really popped. They killed it. And the sales were phenomenal. Like, I think if I remember correctly, just through my own research, and I should be the one to remember this, but it sold like about 500,000 copies like within its first month.
Nice.
And kept selling even more after that. So yeah, the team that put this together really should not have been able to do as good of a job as they did. And it's remarkable that they did.
My memory could be a little fuzzy here, but I don't know that right away, immediately at the time of Virtua Cop, that there was any kind of equivalent game on any competing system. Like, I realized Time Crisis came around that time, maybe a little later, but Virtua Cop was pretty darn novel when it came out, and it was really well done. Yep. And like my own sort of recollections of first playing it is, wow, this looks good. It moves well. The colors are nice. The frame rate is great. And, the music is that, Sega arcade sort of thumping, it was just good. It was just, like to your point, like what you were saying, Ben, how this was the arcade experience at home. For the first time, it like kind of truly was, like sure, there were compromises, but they weren't really all that significant, like you could proudly say, yeah, okay, this machine I invested a ton of money in because the Saturn was bloody expensive back then. It like I'm actually getting an amazing conversion just as Sega had always promised. And I'm curious, Ben, if that was sort of your sentiment as well, that, this was the real deal. And also, too, were there any other games of that sort of nature that you played at the time, or was this pretty unique?
Well, it was unique in the sense that the Saturn, when it was coming out, and these games that we're discussing today, and how much of a quality they were compared to the arcades versus what we were used to in the past. We've gotten arcade ports, in the Nintendo era, in the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis era. We've had them, all the time, and but they just never really paired well compared to what the arcade offering was. And so here comes this game, and on the Saturn, and we find out we can get these arcade quality games, and this is just really amazing. And I love light gun games, and so I've played all of them. I've played Virtua Cop, I've heard Time Crisis, House of the Dead, Vampire Chronicle, anything you can think of. The light gun games are amazing. I love them, and they're just great. And now, as far as how they all compare to Virtual Cop's got its own feel to it, and I like the feel that Virtual Cop has, and it sets it apart from something that people like to compare to, say, like Time Crisis, because you get a lot of comparisons there. It's very much something that I was able to really play long hours.
Is this a game that gamers should pick up and play today? Does it hold up?
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. You can absolutely go back to this game today, and you can basically play this game and have a lot of fun with it. This is one of those games that it's not going to take you much time, because remember, there's only 3 levels. So when you pick it up, you're more than capable to be able to go through the entire game. If you die and you don't make it, it's not that bad to start over and actually go through it, and then you feel pretty accomplished being able to finish the game. And then at that point, it's a score game where you try to do the shooting the gun out of the hands, the triple shot, all these things that can multiply your score and see where you can go from there. And that holds up pretty well.
Okay, so I would agree with all of that. Something I'm going to ask you, Nick. Do you think that this was a game made for the time that it was made? Meaning, like guns and violence and all the rest of it, that's been more in the news these days than it was maybe back in the mid-90s. Do you think that any of that applies here, or is this just a game that's fun and, it's a video game? It's not, it shouldn't be taken as any more than that.
And just for context, this was pre-Columbine. I think that the game itself is so cartoony that it's very difficult to get bogged down in today's political climate while playing it. Of course, police violence is way more of a issue with the bigger spotlight on it now. And in the game, you are playing 2 cops recklessly killing hundreds of criminals without asking questions. But it's, again, so cartoony and so obviously, a video game, like, that it's like not that problematic in today's world. Was it made for the time? Was Virtua Cop made for the time? I think Virtua Cop was made by a bunch of Japanese guys who wanted to make a 3D polygonal light gun game, and they really liked American action movies and wanted to make it look like American action movies, like Die Hard. They kept talking about Die Hard, but there's no. I mean, Stage 3 kind of resembles Nakatomi Plaza a little bit,
Sure.
It's some would argue it resembles Sega HQ, but oh no, they didn't mean to do that. Oh gosh, no. Yeah, I'd say that it's so separated from reality that it's not a problem.
So Ben, you're definitely recommending this for gamers today. Panda, what say you?
I'd say for sure, yeah. I think that both Virtua Cops 1 and 2, I think modern gamers should definitely pick up 2 if they want to play 1 as well. Like, play both is what I'm saying. They're both super duper good in their own rights. They both are some of the Saturn's very best games, and the design of the gameplay itself, especially if you're playing with a light gun, is so much fun. It is an extremely rewarding arcade game to get used to and to try to get that coveted 1 credit clear with, and to learn and to figure out how to be successful in it. And if you're just casual playing it with the buddy in co-op, or just at home, you want to bust out a couple of 5 or 6 credit runs on it just in your own time at the easiest difficulty, you're going to have a ton of fun with that too. It's just so much fun.
And inexpensive.
Yep. Very inexpensive.
Yeah, it's so to be honest, I mean, Saturn games in North America, they're quite pricey nowadays, but this is one of the cheaper ones, and that could be because in subsequent years Sega included this in their 3 free promotion. And so, whether you got it as a standalone game when it was at retail, or later as part of the 3 free, there were a lot of Virtua Cop discs pressed in North America. So any Saturn fan today would do well to give this game a try if they haven't yet. So, yeah, Virtua Cop, I think, gets 3 thumbs up all the way around.
Hell yeah.
Definitely.
All right, on to the second game of the Big Three of 1995. So this one released in North America in mid-November 1995. It was a little bit rushed. It released later in other parts of the world. But Sega Rally, I think, came and, if people were apprehensive that the Saturn couldn't really do good 3D, and they looked to Daytona USA as an example, then Sega Rally kind of put everything just right.
Mm-hmm.
It was, again, a brilliant conversion from a brilliant arcade game. Again, not too many compromises. There were some, as there inevitably would be, but not too many of them. Fantastic control, great graphics, all the rest of it. And it came home just in time for Christmas 95. So, any Sega Rally fans here, gentlemen?
Yes. Big time.
Yes.
Love it.
All right, so let's talk about it. Did you guys experience it in the arcades, or did you get it on the Saturn first? And I realize, Nick, you would have at this point been 1 or 2 years old. So.
Yeah, I'm out of that one. That's Ben. That's you and Ben.
Okay.
Ben, did you?
Okay, so yeah. So this was definitely one that I've also played in the arcade. But what's interesting is I never had this game for the Saturn until like way later, like years later, which would have been years ago from now. But we're talking like way after the Saturn is done. So I had never played this game on the Saturn until that point. So my experience with this one was all in the arcade back in the day. And then when I finally was able to play this thing on the Saturn, I was like, wow, okay, yeah, this is exactly what I remember at the arcade too.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I know folks griped about in the press with Sega Rally is that the rear view mirror from the arcade version was absent on the Saturn port. But I mean, this is true, it was absent.
Yeah, they're correct.
To me, that's a huge nitpick. Because you have a game that comes out that appears to be 5 or 6 iterations further along the development curve when compared to a game like Daytona USA on the Saturn, or even Virtua Racing on the Saturn. This thing was smooth frame rate, it controlled fabulously, great sidetrack scenery, it was just phenomenal. And but it kind of made me wonder, okay, was this some sort of PlayStation bias that was creeping into the press? Whatever, regardless, it reviewed very, very well. And it's a game that came packed in with the very first Saturn that I got myself. So very, sort of special place in my, gaming heart, if you will. And I absolutely loved it. I loved the crazy, ending song that plays, and it took me years to try to figure out what the heck he was even saying when he was singing the song. I loved discovering the secret lakeside track. I loved the fact that the drifting felt so natural and so good, and you really had to work at getting better at this game and being able to negotiate all the different twists and turns. And there's a couple other sort of neat aspects to this game, that I've found through years and years of playing. But I'm going to just turn it over to you, Nick. So, ultimately at some point you got to know Sega Rally, and so I want to know that story. So by this time it had been out for ages, I'm sure.
Right. Yeah.
You had graduated out of diapers before you were able to pick up the Saturn controller and give it a play.
I learned to walk. Yeah. It was a big moment, learning to walk. I don't remember anything about it, but it was probably a big deal, I'm sure. Eventually I would, grow not several feet, but many feet taller, and get a Sega Saturn in high school. And Sega Rally was one of the games that I picked up and tried out and kind of put back and, didn't really pay much attention to. But sometime in the last 3 or 4 years, I obtained a physical copy of it after buying like a collection of games from a guy in town here where I live. And I'm like, I really ought to get into this game. And I think I played it for, at least an hour a night for a month or so. It's so good. There's only 4 tracks in the game, 2 cars, well, 3 cars if you count the secret car. But everything is so tight and well designed that the process of learning the game, playing it casually, then, finally grinding it until you're able to beat arcade mode without running out of time, then grinding to be able to get first place in arcade mode, and then grinding to be able to beat Lakeside. And then there's a whole nother layer of, if you hadn't already learned how to drive in manual, learning how to drift with the manual shift. The mechanics of gear drifting in Sega Rally are slick and extremely well done. If you really get to that advanced level, it's extremely rewarding. Then it becomes grinding your time down to be the best on the default leaderboard until you beat the coveted Unk score, or beat the Uncle, as some might call it. It's someone whose initials are UNK. But yeah, everybody wants to beat Uncle. And then, all right, I'm in the low 320s. I'm in 322, 321. And it's like, it's so, so good. You got to play the game in manual shift, by the way. Here's something I thought Sega Rally did remarkably well for the time. So many racing games, I think even Daytona USA had this problem. The steering from arcade to D-pad, and I mean like digital input D-pad, people that made racing games struggled with that. In Sega Rally, it was so good that playing Sega Rally with the D-pad is almost more optimal than trying to play it with the analog controllers. I don't know if they just did a horrible job with the analog controllers, but every time I try the wheel, the 3D pad on Sega Rally, I'm like, can't do it. I got to go back to the D-pad. It controls so much better. I don't know if you guys agree with that. There was a guy in a British TV show from the 90s who said that, but that was about all I could find online of people saying that.
I don't even really think I've tried it with the regular D-pad. I'm going to have to try
Really?
that now. Yeah. Like,
oh, well, maybe you prefer the analog. I don't know. Maybe It's just what you learn.
That'll be interesting. I'll have to get some feedback on that one now.
Same here. I've mostly played with the D-pad. I did own a Saturn wheel for a while, and I couldn't quite get into it with the wheel the same as I could with the digital D-pad. And then the other thing, too, is, the game is compatible with the 3D control pad, but it was... the 3D control pad came after the Saturn version of Sega Rally, and so
right.
It works, but it's not maybe optimized for it. So maybe that's why the sensation isn't quite what it needs to be.
The 3D control pad is treated as a racing wheel. It inputs like it's a racing wheel essentially. It just tricks it into saying this is a racing wheel.
Yeah, and to be honest, Sega Rally Netlink, the later version of that, did give proper 3D pad support. However, this version of Sega Rally didn't quite have it because the pad wasn't out yet. But yeah, I mean the digital D-pad inputs and the control is so good. You never feel if you smash into a wall, or you don't quite take a turn the way you intended, or whatever, or you mess up. You never feel that it's because of the controls. That it's because you should have braked a little bit sooner, or you shouldn't have taken that corner as aggressively, or whatever the case may be. So to me, that is a hallmark of a really, really well done racing game. And that's what made it really fun. It made you want to go back and do a little bit better each time and improve. And I'm wondering, like, Ben, what was your experience with it once you did get it on the Saturn?
Once I did get it on the Saturn, I was always playing it with the steering wheel. Okay, so that's another important thing. I've never actually played it with a D-pad, which I know sounds odd, but I'm a peripheral kind of guy, so I love light gun games, because you can use the light gun. And so when I get a racing game and I've got a steering wheel available, that's what I'm playing it with. And so I thought that the responsiveness of the control in the game was actually pretty decent. And because now there was a big jump between when I was playing it at the arcade versus when I was playing at home. But the fact that I was able to get into it, very easily and be able to control it really well, makes me believe that they did a really good job at the control scheme.
And that's not the only thing they did really well. I mean, visually, that game came over so well. And, you know, I've kind of wondered, I mean, obviously Tetsuya Mizuguchi and his team spent some time coding this game, you know, to be as good as it is. And they've perhaps, you know, had some learnings from previous teams, who knows? Um, but I also kind of wonder whether the arcade original was sort of more suited to a Saturn port compared to, for example, Daytona. Like, you didn't have, you know, the 30-40 cars that you can have in Daytona, so there's a lot less, you know, processing resources being diverted towards AI. You know, some of the trackside detail was quite closed in, so, you know, you didn't have to have too much of a draw distance issue. And even in the open fields, especially in the desert, you know, in that animal sanctuary area, you know, it is a big open space, but there isn't that much scenery there for the Saturn to have to crunch through. And so to me, that was just, you know, it lent itself better towards a Saturn conversion. And yeah, it, you know, they just knocked it out of the park. You know, I have an interesting story I want to share with you guys. In the first level, the desert level, there's a section that you have to drive through that has like these three bumps, right? You kind of go through these bumps, and you sort of hop over, and you get a little bit of air time.
Over a jump.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, I always loved going through those jumps, and I kind of like, well, how do I get them to be bigger? How do I get more air? You know, like, how do I do this? No such jumps in any of the other courses that I could find. Nothing even close to this. But I had, you know, this idea to drive this course in reverse. And if you take those three jumps in reverse, that third one sends you absolutely flying, like 5-6 seconds of airtime before smashing down into the ground. And I loved that kind of stuff, that you could, you know, you could just kind of mess around with the game and kind of do what you want with it, and just have a ton of fun. So I'm curious if you guys did anything similar, or you know, discovered like interesting little things or tidbits that kind of made you appreciate the game all that much more.
Yeah, I got to do an interview with Ken Ibrahim, who voices over the Navigator, and he is in the Virtua Cop documentary briefly, since he voices the hostages in that game. But he pointed out to me that all the audience members are just pictures of the developers pasted in as textures. And he himself is also in it. Ken Ibrahim, the Navigator, is the man in the black and gray striped sweatshirt, long sleeve shirt. And so it's kind of funny. You're driving this car where there's a guy in your passenger seat giving you directions, but that same guy is basically in the audience, cloned multiple times, waving at you as you drive by. So that's kind of a fun tidbit.
Okay, I'm curious, and I'll ask you both this question. Which is your preferred car in the game?
Celica.
Yep.
And manual.
Yep. Same.
You as well? Okay. Interesting. I quite like driving the Delta.
Ooh, a Delta man, a Lancia stand.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, and
it's good. They're both good.
Okay, so on the one hand, drifting is a little bit more complicated, I find, with the Delta, but you know, the Celica or Celica, and both I've learned both pronunciations are actually correct. Drifting is a little bit harder with the Delta, but I don't know. There's something about its compactness that appeals to me, and you know, if someone held a gun to my head, a Virtua gun to my head, and you know, and I had to absolutely pick the car that I was going to drive to the finish line, I would definitely pick the Delta. What about the Stratus? Did you guys experience mess around with that car or no?
I was about to ask you about it, because I was like, I couldn't remember the name. I think it was the Strato, and I was Stratus, and you said Stratus, and I was like, yes. And that was one of those that you had to put in like a code on when you're selecting the Celica, if I remember right. And it was a fun car, but I remember it being a little bit more difficult.
You can also unlock it natively if you beat arcade mode and get first place. I think you also have to beat Lakeside afterward, if I remember correct. Google knows. Look it up. Look it up, listeners.
Later Sega racing games, so I'm talking about games especially like Sega Touring Car and other ones, you know, when those racing games would come home, they would often feature, you know, bonus tracks, or even things like, you know, different times of day as you're racing and things like that. And we didn't get too much of that in Sega Rally. It was much more of a straightforward conversion.
The Stratos was Saturn only. That was kind of the big addition that they got, in addition to like being able to play in time attack and 3 laps and 2-player and whatnot at home.
Oh, speaking of, did you guys ever make use of the ghost car feature?
In time attack?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nifty.
Nice. Ben, did you spend a lot of time?
That was actually something interesting to do when you had the ghost car going in time attack, because of course you got it set for the first time or the best time that you're actually racing, and then it's like, oh, this jerk is about to get away from me. Oh, that's just me from a different race. So that was always fun to try to beat.
Yeah. And I mean, boy, did that ever crunch through your memory. So you couldn't save a ghost car into the system's onboard memory. There just wasn't enough of it. So you did have to have a memory cartridge in your Saturn to be able to take advantage of ghost cars. But that was really the case with many of the racing games that implemented ghost cars. But yeah, definitely. The other big sort of feature that Sega Rally had that Daytona USA didn't is Sega Rally allowed for 2-player split screen racing. And I personally remember doing tons and tons of races in split screen, in Sega Rally. And, you get your standard features like, boost, speed boost for the car that's trailing, or you can set it not just for who gets to the finish line first, but, if there's enough of a time distance between the two racers, then the race ends. There's all kinds of ways to sort of set these races up. You could even tune cars and you can use your tuned cars in these races. So there's just a lot more options, even though, you may not be able to say, oh, this has got extra tracks or whatever, because it didn't. There was definitely a lot of options for gamers to mess with. And just curious what your guys' thoughts are on the 2-player mode on Saturn if you've played it.
I played it with a couple of buddies before, and the gameplay is retained. You lose some draw distance in 2-player, and you lose a lot of the environmental features like the animals and some trees and stuff, but like the gameplay is still the same and the frame rate stays true, so it's a lot of fun. 2-player in Sega Rally is for sure a fun time.
What about you, Ben? Have you played this game in 2-player on Saturn?
I actually have not. I've just now gotten Megan into some of this old Saturn stuff that she's starting to enjoy it. So I'm hoping to get her into some of this 2-player stuff like this one. But as far as me actually doing 2-player on this one before, I actually have not yet. Not on the split screen for sure.
Interesting. Okay. This would have been the perfect game to have running over a link cable. But alas, that wasn't to be. We'll talk a little bit later in the cast about the Netlink edition of Sega Rally and what that got right. But yeah, there was definitely no link cable support for this game. Any final thoughts on Sega Rally for the Saturn?
I guess if I can talk about some of the development stuff a little bit, unless you just want to kind of move on from that.
No, let's do it.
Hell yeah. It had a story development cycle. A couple of interesting things about it that I'll point out. The developers Tetsuya Mizuguchi and the 10 or so other guys at Sega AM3 went on multiple road trips, 1-2-week-long road trip across the West Coast and into Mexico, West Coast of the United States and into Mexico. And they took pictures of the deserts and other environments in Yosemite and all these other places, and used some of those pictures as inspiration for the track design in the arcade game. And even imported some of those pictures of trees and stuff in the buildings as textures for some of the objects in the environments. You don't hear a lot about developers going on road trips when before they make their video game. And one other fun fact is that the Saturn port is not using the source code of the arcade version, despite it being developed in-house by the same guy. Tetsuya Mizuguchi did both the arcade and Saturn ports. They decided, because of how different Saturn was from Model 2, that they better start from scratch. And of course, since they had the same artist painting the picture on a separate canvas with different paint, it still turned out really well. But it is, at its core, a very different video game from the arcade version, even though most people will play them and be like, yep, this is a great arcade conversion. It plays really well. And it does. They're both very good games. But there are a lot of weird differences.
I'd be really interested to know whether they used the Sega graphics library at all, or whether they did most of their coding like pretty close to the metal on this game.
Right. My understanding, based on the source material that's been translated that I have seen, is that it does not really use SGL. If it does, it's not using it that much at all. This was not really an SGL game like Virtua Cop and Virtua Fighter 2 were.
Interesting. And so really, I mean, Virtua Cop and now Sega Rally, they're doing a great job to show the world not just that the Saturn is more than capable of handling complex, advanced 3D games, but I think it's also a way for Sega to show third-party developers who maybe have struggled with the platform a little bit that, hey, you can really get some fantastic 3D out of the Saturn. It isn't just that, it's a 2D sprite pusher. From that perspective, anyways, I think it did a good job. Ben, any final thoughts on the game?
Yeah. The thing that I want people to understand is this is not Daytona USA. This is also not Gale Racer. This is a completely different style of racing game. And so even if you like or dislike either of those other two, you may like this one, you may not. But most people that have played this game who actually do enjoy any type of racing game have found that they really enjoy this game. They really like it. So this is one of those that comes with good recommendation. And I know Nick just mentioned that this didn't even start with the source code. And I thought that was amazing because when I played this game years later, I was like, oh yeah, that's the arcade game. It's just a perfectly well ported version. And so I think that's super fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of neat how they were able to pull that off. Probably helps that the same guy made it, but yeah. And they did import some textures from the arcade version, though significantly downgraded in pixel fidelity. But yeah, it's super well done. I think it's the best racing game on Saturn, in my opinion. When you think about Daytona, Need for Speed, Initial D, Drift King, you think about how they control the Virtua Racing port. While it had a lot of good tracks and cars, Sega Rally just did what they did correctly.
Did it well. Yeah.
So the eternal question, Saturn fans often argue which is the better racing game on the Saturn. Is it Daytona USA, warts and all, but plays like a dream, or is it Sega Rally? I'm curious which camp you gentlemen fall in.
Rally, 100%.
That's a tough one. I honestly am in the Daytona camp, just because that's more my style of racing and because of what I like in that one. But that being said, I still like this game. This is a very good game.
Nice. And then, so for me personally, that's a really tough call because Daytona is just a phenomenal game. But I guess maybe just on technical merit, I'm going to give the nod to Rally, even though they both play super well. And so I guess to wrap up on Sega Rally, I think it's pretty safe to say that all of us give it a hearty recommendation that folks should be trying this game even now in the 2020s. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the last of our big three titles of 1995. So this released in North America in late November of 95, and I'm talking about Virtua Fighter 2. So, if Virtua Cop sold well and got good press coverage, then Sega Rally, same thing, very well received, very positive reviews, and then came Virtua Fighter 2. So, this was the sort of 1, 2, 3 punch that Sega was really hoping to deliver for the holidays of 95, and they did. I do believe this is the top-selling Saturn game of all time. Phenomenally well received in Japan, as expected, and equally as well received in North America because it was a solid fighting game and it was just just light years ahead of what we saw with Virtua Fighter 1 on the Saturn. So, I'll start the same sort of rounds of questions. Ben, did you enjoy this game in the arcades before it came out?
I actually did not play this much at all in the arcades. I gave it a try because, of course, as a kid, you play everything and see what you think of it. But I found that this one just didn't resonate with me like the other ones did.
See, and I remember seeing the original Virtua Fighter in the arcades and thinking, wow, this is 3D. This is clearly different and what have you. And eventually seeing Virtua Fighter 2 with the textured polygons and everything. And it was just unbelievable. It was unbelievable to me. Nick, I know you didn't play this in the arcades at the time.
I did not.
So tell me about how you got acquainted with Saturn Virtua Fighter 2.
I got acquainted with it. It was one of the first games I tried out when I initially got a Saturn and a mod chip. I had a copy of it, so even before I had the mod chip, I was playing it because it was among the first Saturn games I obtained. It's probably, if it's not the most, it's definitely one of the most common games to acquire if you're collecting, and it's still pretty affordable even with today's retro market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kicks Tekken's ass. That's a debatable topic. Some people would disagree, but I remember thinking like, wow, this plays so fluidly. It's so crisp. The movement is just great. There are so many different combos for each character. It was like trying to order off a menu at a Chinese restaurant every time you pick a new character, like thinking, oh, what combo am I going to learn now? How am I going to use this move? And if you don't want to sink your teeth into the weeds of how all the characters work and tick, you can casually bust through it and just mash through and still have a fun time. Very good game. I can't offer a personal experience playing it in the late 90s, but I did talk to a Jason Steele, who's known for Charlie the Unicorn, for an article like a couple of years ago about omakase sabers. But he said that he first encountered the Saturn at a mall in 1996, and it had a demo of Virtua Fighter 2 playing. And he said that was his first time seeing a textured 3D game, and that was what got him into wanting a Saturn, and eventually accumulated enough birthday and Christmas money to get one. Still his favorite console to this day. That goes to show that this game really, we didn't see a lot of stuff like that in 1995, and those who did see it, it was kind of like magic just happened.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it is kind of interesting how I ended up getting into this game years later. I had gotten into my Dreamcast pretty heavy, and I was playing, your usual round of one of the games was Soul Calibur. And so I really enjoyed Soul Calibur, and it took another friend of mine to point out, hey, you might like Virtua Fighter and Virtua Fighter 2 and Remix and all that if you like Soul Calibur so much. And so I was like, really? I tried that out years ago. It just wasn't my flavor. And so I tried it out again, and sure enough, I was playing it, just on that hook during that time. It was actually pretty great.
Yeah, and, Virtua Fighter 2 was one of the first few games that I ended up buying for the Saturn. And again, what a showpiece, first of all, graphically. The sound, again, just that pumping arcade music. So good, right? And it played like a dream, and it was so fluid, and it just, it was wonderful. And again, it's funny because Virtua Fighter 1 had come out mere months before that in North America at the launch, so we're talking, way less than a year ago. And so the leap in quality from Virtua Fighter 1 on the Saturn to Virtua Fighter 2 it was unbelievable. And so really for me, seeing first Virtua Cop and then Sega Rally and then Virtua Fighter 2, I mean, it made me a believer. If there were any doubts for me personally at the time that maybe I didn't pick the right horse, this isn't going to have, some very solid games, it can't keep up with what Sony's doing or whatever. I mean, this just showed me that not only can it keep up, but it can smash what the PlayStation is doing.
Oh yeah, it busted the doors right down. It was good.
Absolutely, right? So to me, it was just, And it's funny that Virtua Fighter 2 was the third game, of that big three, because that was a game that whole series is traditionally was so huge in Japan, but it wasn't, it didn't really have the same sort of pull in North America. I mean, here at the time it was Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, but not so much Virtua Fighter. But VF2 came out, and just I think by virtue of being so technically amazing and such an awesome conversion from the arcade original, it made a big splash. Um, you know, so something interesting about the North American releases of Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega Rally, for that matter, those were the only two games that released in the Saturn's entire North American lifespan that were released at retail in that silver foil instead of
Oh yeah.
the plain white barbershop striped packaging. And so, of course, it stood out on the shelves. And, I'm kind of thinking, I would say Virtua Cop should have probably also had the same sort of
Yeah.
silver foil treatment, I guess, if it was possible. But, oh, super well deserved. And, and Sega never did it for any other Saturn release as long as the system was current. So those were the two. Let's dive into the game. Any thoughts? Like, for example, you've got the arcade original soundtrack all in Red Book audio, but then you've also got a remixed version of each and every character's tune. And so, any preferences? Any favorite character that you like to main with?
Oh, Sarah's always been my favorite character in Virtua Fighter. That's never gonna change. Um, Super good fast movement. Her punches and kicks come out super fast. She's got that pinwheel kick, which is real money. Like, yeah, Jackie's got something like that too, but the other Brian sibling is just, in my opinion, way better.
Mm.
I really kind of enjoyed Cage, just because I seem to be like, I like the ninja fighters, and so I saw Cage and I was like, yeah, that's my guy.
As for me, so I like Leon, which
Nice.
He's a new fighter to Virtua Fighter 2. He wasn't in the original game, and he's just got such a quick and unorthodox set of moves. And I mean, you could argue that Shun-Di is the same way. I mean, he's just bonkers, right? I mean, his fight style, the drunken style is really kind of interesting to watch, but just to play that sort of quick darting of Leon, I guess is the correct pronunciation. I mean, I love it. I love his moveset. And he's a very appealing character to me, and I would go on to like him in Virtua Fighter 3 as well.
You are required by Canadian law to prefer Wolf Hockfield. You know this, right?
This is true. Yes, the wrestler. He does have a very interesting howl, does he not? Like when he wins. He's
yeah, he does.
Best. It's the best.
Yep. Oh, and he's Canadian.
He is Canadian. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think his level. So interesting. The arcade original, his stage was actually enclosed. There was there was an enclosure around the ring, but in the Saturn conversion that just went away, and the ring is just a plain ring without any sort of enclosure. So that kind of speaks to some of the differences between the home version and the arcade version. And I'm just wondering, like, Ben, do you recall from the time when this game released on the Saturn? So there was the one group of sort of folks, media, whatever, that would say, okay, this is a great conversion, Sega did an amazing job, etc. And then there was a second set of folks who would say, well, but in the arcade version, on Shun's stage, that they're on a river, they're floating down, and then the bridges, you pass underneath some amazing bridges, and that's not in the Saturn version. And it was one of those facepalm moments for me where it was like, okay, yes, the bridges aren't there, but 99% of the game is there. I'm curious if you got any of that as well, when Virtua Fighter was current, if you heard any of that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. So I used to hear all through the grapevine, all the differences between sprite work and 3D work that was going between console ports versus the arcade originals, all the time. I've heard about them so much, would say like X-Men versus Street Fighter and stuff like that. But when it came to like Virtua Fighter, especially like the first one to the second one, So I remember the grapevine talk was with the first one was like, oh, it's so much lacking compared to the arcade, oh, this and that. But then when the second one came out, I do remember that a lot of people were like, wow, this is really well polished. And I remember things being pointed that were different, but the people at the time didn't really seem to mind. So it wasn't like these game breaking differences or things that brought you out of the immersion of the experience. And so I don't remember the cage specifically being spoken about not being in the Saturn version, but I do remember that the grapevine talk was that Virtua Fighter 2 was quite fantastic of a port.
Nice. Well, so as a technical accomplishment, this game ran at a smooth 60 frames per second, and it ran in the Saturn's highest possible resolution, which was actually a touch higher than the Model 2 arcade original. So, on a technical level, I mean, this game was just lights out. It was just phenomenal.
It ran so well because unlike the port of the first Virtua Fighter game to Saturn, it made proper use of the two video display processors. In Virtua Fighter 1, you saw a lot of polygon pop out on the stage itself, whereas in Virtua Fighter 2, we don't see that at all. The VDP1, as many know, was meant for like the characters and players and objects, and VDP2 was for the backgrounds. In Virtua Fighter 1 on Saturn, they just tried to do everything in VDP1, and that didn't work out super great. Whereas in VF2, and we also saw this in Virtua Fighter Remix, they used VDP2 to render out the floors and the backgrounds and the scenery as like basically mode 7 sprites on crack. And then let VDP1 handle just the characters and some of the I think the UI bits might have been split between the two. And that really helped it run super well. And unlike many early Saturn games, Virtua Fighter 2 actually uses both of the processors. The Saturn's infamous dual processor, many developers resorted to using just one. They both share the same memory bus, which basically means you can't use both processors at the same time. What Yu Suzuki did for the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 2 is he made the two processors trade off. They were firing off, 1 2 1 2 1 2, like taking turns to fire off code into the game at a very, very fast speed. And it was basically one processor per character on screen. One of the dual processors would handle Akira, while the second processor would handle the Jackie that Akira is fighting. And this was, according to an interview with Yu Suzuki, very, very, very difficult to do, and something that he only expects 1 in 100 programmers to be good enough to get that working on a Saturn. So that was pretty remarkable. And that really, all that stuff combined really lent to Virtua Fighter 2's ability to run properly at 60 frames per second without dropping. But it came with the sacrifice of some environmental features not being rendered.
Yeah, I mean, and again, though, the overall impact from a gamer perspective was, holy cow, did we just jump 3 or 4 development generations, up from Virtua Fighter 1, Daytona USA. Now we've got SEGA Rally, we've got Virtua Fighter 2. Like, they were just so good, and the characters, they're so different. It's not that they share a very small sort of basic common move set, but then they've got just a list of moves that's a page and a half long, and they're all based on real martial arts too, right? So there's not it's a very sort of realistic game from that perspective. I mean, arguably the floating jumps maybe isn't the greatest realism, but
rune physics aside, yes.
Right, yeah, physics aside, like those were this wasn't fireballs and fatalities and all that kind of stuff, which in Japan it was huge, it was big, and the tournaments that would be held there and everything, and the storyline was important. Who won the first Virtua Fighter tournament? Who won the second one? Et cetera, and what about Jiral, and who is she or he? We didn't know at the time. You if you finish the game with certain characters, you get to find that out in Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn, but I'm not going to spoil it here, maybe, but yeah, this was a game that certainly had its share of depth and following, depending on, I guess, where you were in the world. And I personally got quite deep into the game. Like, there was a time when I was younger where, I would go for a few months playing that game exclusively and learning, a character or a couple characters really, really well and deeply. And at the end of the day, the experience to me felt like a really well done sort of chess match on speed. Like it was strategic. You had, there were reversals you could pull off. You could goad your character into your opponent into a ring out. So there were all kinds of strategies, and it was just a bucket of fun. So, and I'm curious if you guys got into the game as deep as that, and maybe some of your interesting experiences with it.
I definitely played through the game and tried to figure out any of the little different nuances and the moves, and the move list was crazy. Like, I come from an area where I'm used to, say, Mortal Kombat, where you have, maybe four special moves at the time. And so I come over to Virtua Fighter 2, and basically you're going to hit a combo or a special move at some point very easily just by what you're mashing on the controller. And once you get better at it, it's more interesting, of course, to try to master these moves and to combo chain them together. And then it becomes a much different, more interesting game than just simply being like a button mashing fighter, if you're playing against your friends. And but once you get into that and find that, holy crap, there's a whole lot of moves that each character can do, and then each character has a little bit of a different style to them, so you can kind of find which one kind of fits your kind of play style particularly, then it becomes a really, really unique and well-tailored game for you particularly. And I think that's what makes this thing stand out and hold true to the test of time, unlike Virtua Fighter 1. Virtua Fighter 1 would, no, don't even worry about that one. But Virtua Fighter 2, yes, this is the one you would want to go with for sure.
What about you, Nick?
Yeah, I really got into it in high school when I was first getting into the Saturn. And I'm like, gee, I got to 1 credit clear this with Sarah on default settings. And I eventually did. Got to know her combos pretty well. The only issue was this was a game I couldn't really play with friends that much because they all hated playing against me in Virtua Fighter, since I was the only kid my age in St. Paul, Minnesota, who put any amount of time into a Virtua Fighter game. So no one knew how to play it except me. So, nice. All my friends hated playing Virtua Fighter basically because of that. So I never really got to play it against other people that much. They were all Street Fighter guys. So I would just, if we wanted to do a multiplayer fighting game, it was either Smash Bros. Or Street Fighter. No, none of them wanted to mess with Virtua Fighter. Yeah. But I still like to have fun with it every now and then.
So, fun fact, Virtua Fighter 2, the arcade cabinet, was actually featured pretty heavily in an X-Files episode.
Really?
Do you know which one I'm talking about, right?
No, I don't.
I'm trying to remember which one, because I was a big X-Files guy, and I don't remember.
Okay, so, it's probably earlier in the series, and there's this guy in some small little town who can, control electric things with his mind or whatever, and he causes all kinds of people to die or what have you, right? And Mulder and Scully are investigating or whatever. And this guy, though, loves hanging out in the local arcade. And the only game he plays is Virtua Fighter 2. And they show a lot of gameplay. They show him playing. They show just the screen. It's pretty, it's product placement, I'm sure. But it was really well done. So, a few years ago, the girlfriend and I were going through an X-Files marathon. We watched the entire series beginning to end. And during that episode, I just had this goofy grin on my face the entire time, because to me, that is the Virtua Fighter 2 episode on the X-Files. So yeah, it was just one of those things. So, Sega obviously did try here in North America to sort of have this game, explode into the public consciousness. I don't think they were obviously nearly as successful as they were over in Japan, because in Japan that was a religion there, the whole Virtua Fighter phenomenon. But still, Virtua Fighter 2, and especially the super solid Saturn port, it got a lot of positive press. So it was a win for Sega for sure. So. With that said, I'm curious, just as an aside, do either of you guys follow the Virtua Fighter series now? Like, do you play VF5? Did you play Virtua Fighter 3 on Dreamcast? Or how did that turn out?
So what ended up happening with me is, remember, I first played Virtua Fighter 2 at the arcade, decided that really wasn't my jam, and didn't pick it up until after playing Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast. And so I played Soul Calibur, then I went Virtua Fighter 2. But then after I did Virtua Fighter 2, I was like, hey, this is actually pretty good. And I went back in and played Virtua Fighter 3. I have not played any of the subsequent Virtua Fighters. It's not because I hadn't wanted to, it's just because they haven't really been on my radar. So it wasn't something I had really actively had picked up. But I did definitely follow from 2 to 3, and that's where I've left off.
What about you, Nick?
Usually when I pick up a Virtua game, it's Fighters Megamix. That's a rare occasion where I can convince friends to play that one because it's Fighters Megamix. You can play as a car, a panda inflatable, like there's crazy stuff to it. Mm-hmm. And it has pretty much the same movement mechanics and such as Virtua Fighter 2, save for a few moves. And that's that. Do I go back to Virtua Fighter 2 every now and then? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'll burn through arcade mode with Sarah every now and then. Sometimes I just get the feeling I'm like, I gotta play it. I gotta beat Dural. So
is this a game that Saturn fans today should give a try?
Yes. I think that if you had to choose between VF2 and Fighters Megamix, you should play Fighters Megamix, but VF2 should still be in your library. That stands up on its own really well, simply for the character balance that Fighters Megamix obviously does not have. But it is an extremely well polished fighting game. The graphics and frame rate and everything about it's some of the best Sega Saturn performance from the hardware you are ever going to get on this console. It's just so good. A necessary part of anyone's collection. It must play.
Yeah, I agree with Nick on that one. The even his Fighters Megamix comment is that, Fighters Megamix is fun, but Virtua Fighter 2 is kind of like the more serious, balanced take of that game, and it's just really well balanced all around. It is so smooth. Again, please ignore Virtua Fighter 1, go straight to Virtua Fighter 2. You'll have a little bit of a distaste if you start with the first one, but the second one is just so amazing. It's so clean. The way it plays is just, you're going to have a lot of fun with it. I think Sega knocked it out of the park with these 3 games coming out the gate. I think they did a really good job with selection, with variety, and quality on top of it.
I'll agree with that, Ben. I think that's a really nice segue into, when I look back at, what these 3 games meant and what they heralded, at least from my perspective as a Saturn gamer, during the console's lifespan. It almost felt like at the beginning, those first few months, Sega was still trying to find their way with what it meant to, to create 3D, 32-bit games. Virtua Fighter played great, but it had all kinds of graphical issues and pop-up. Daytona USA, same situation. It felt rough, And then over and above that, a lot of the games that were releasing at the time, it's almost as if developers of the time period were just kind of throwing whatever they could at the wall and seeing what stuck. And then, in November and into December of 95, Sega released boom, 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 these 3, absolutely phenomenal games that were light years ahead of what was available on the Saturn. And it's almost like, it opened a new sort of chapter in Saturn software. And yes, there would still be some mediocre games obviously coming out after that, but the standard had been set, that this is what can be done. This is what players can and should expect from the Saturn and from Sega and so on. And it just kind of showed Sony that, hey, we may be down at the moment, but we are not out, and we're going to hit you as hard as we can, in the fight for market share and market dollars. So, it was an important trio of games. And, you only have to look to the 3 free that were released a few years later. 2 out of these 3 games made it into that 3 free promotion. The only one that didn't is Sega Rally, and instead we got Daytona USA in the 3 free. But Virtua Fighter 2 and Virtua Cop were both included in that 3 free promotion, which ran for quite some time for Sega, and it did actually markedly increase sales during the times that the promotion was running. So, super phenomenal games. Virtua Fighter 2 gets my recommendation, and so do the other 2. Worthy of being in any Saturn player's library. All of them relatively cheap still today, because they were printed in such high quantities. And, this just cream of the crop. Some really, really solid games. And so I just, I want to get now you guys' sense of the importance of these 3 games, what you, whether through your own experience or through later research or whatever, what you saw as, sort of the big impact of these games on Sega, on the Saturn, on its fortunes in the West, on the video game sort of industry in general. Just some insights into what you think these 3 games meant.
To me, these 3 games meant that we could have arcade quality games at home. We could have real showcasing of what we were experiencing at the arcades at the time, which was not very heard of. That's just not what you did. And the fact that we were able to do that, have fun, different variety of games. Like, we're talking about a shooter, a fighter, and a racer. And so, normally when you have games coming out for a console, you have a platformer is usually what they're trying to lead with. And Sega decided to do something a little different here, and it really worked for them. And like you say, these are very inexpensive games for the Saturn. Saturn's notoriously expensive to collect for, but these are relatively inexpensive because of their print run. But it also proves that the price of a game is not telling you what the quality of a game is. Like, these are 3 of the cheapest games on the system, and they're also 3 of the best games on the system. So it's something you definitely want to have in your collection for sure. And there was so much here that Sega actually was able to achieve with, say, the Ragtag Crew, being able to pump out a port that was just phenomenal when they were expected to fail, or a complete ground-up build of a game that was so similar to the arcade that a lot of us thought it was literally an arcade port. And then you have Virtua Fighter 2 that decided, hey, we're going to fix what we did from the first game. We're going to use all the chips, everything at our disposal, and they succeeded. Like, technically, these games are something of a marvel for the time. And it's just something that it's easy to forget over the course of time and over the course of history and, other things that have come out. And we forget all these details. But everything about these 3 games they basically just carved the way to lead us into having better quality games from that point on.
I couldn't agree more. That's my sentiments exactly. What about you, Nick?
By, toward the end of 1995, the Saturn and PlayStation were pretty close in terms of console sales. I don't remember the exact numbers, but they were not that far off from each other. And I think these 3 games to cap off 95 and get released just in time for the holiday season in the West. One thing to keep in mind, Sega Rally came out in America before Japan. Japan got it January on Saturn, and they pumped out an earlier version of the game for the US. There's more graphical features present in the Japanese version you don't see in the US port. That's because they wanted it in time for Christmas. They wanted it out before Black Friday, which they did. It made it by November 18th. And Virtua Fighter 2 at the butt end of November on the 30th.
Yeah,
Virtua Cop came out on the 10th of November. The overall plan was to really get this out there in September 2nd, the original release date. If the console came out on September 2nd, they basically would have been able to promote, hey, these 3 games are coming like in a month or 2. They're right around the corner. And if these 3 were what the Saturn got in the press instead of the early launch and the crappy games that came with it, the impression overall in the West would have been much stronger. I don't know if the Saturn would have beat the PlayStation, but it's you anyone at the time who got to see these three games in action be like, oh, okay, the Saturn can do 3D now. It's here to play. It's here to compete with Sony. Like, these are on par or better than what we're getting on the PlayStation. Virtua Fighter 2 looked better than whatever Tekken game was running on PlayStation. And Sega Rally was performing super well. Virtua Cop was performing super well. Kind of a sales thing too. Fun fact about all three of those games is they were all marketing their own peripheral. The racing wheel with Rally, obviously the gun with Virtua Cop, and the arcade stick with Virtua Fighter 2. It was kind of the Barbie console because it came with so many accessories that they wanted you to buy separately. But yeah, it was really Sega's way of saying, hey, we can do 3D. It looks really good. And we're bringing the arcade to your house. And it's not just, a crappy port of Mortal Kombat to your house. It's like, no, we're bringing the arcade to your house. Joysticks and all. It's upsetting that it didn't do better, but it obviously did super well, even with the circumstances that Sega in the West had with how many copies they sold and how successful they were. And they did bring a lot of people into the 5th gen that didn't go to Sony right away.
Yeah, and when you look at the Saturn's North American story, it's such a sad tale of self-inflicted wound after self-inflicted wound. But boy, is this ever a bright, shining spot on that dark and broken path. It's
a win for Sega. This was these three games were a major win.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we've covered our three big games of 1995. I just want to take 5 minutes now to talk about an obscure game, and it was a follow-up to Sega Rally, and that is the Sega Rally Netlink Edition, which did release several years later in North America. It was exclusive to North America. There was a similar X-Band version that came out in Japan, and then there was no equivalent release in the PAL territories. But this was essentially SEGA Rally Championship as we knew it, with Netlink support. So you could play friends or enemies over the internet, although it was marketed as over the internet, but really it was over phone lines. And you could have, solid matches with folks across the country. You were limited only by, who you could essentially call up on dial-up. There were other improvements to the game itself. So a lot of the graphical features that missed out on the North American version that were subsequently put into the Japanese version did make a comeback into Sega Rally Netlink. And the 3D control pad, which had been released prior to the Netlink version of Sega Rally, it was properly natively supported by Sega Rally. So there's a whole bunch of graphical features that were added in. There's some extra ghost car options. You could sort of fiddle around with how your ghost cars could look, etc. So a lot of the changes were quite minor, I suppose, but there was the Netlink aspect to it. Now, I'm fairly certain none of us enjoyed Netlink gaming back in the day. Because Nick, you were too young. You were doing the diaper thing and everything.
Yeah, I was pooping myself.
There is that. Yeah, and I mean, I should ask Ben, were you a Netlink gamer back in the day?
I wish, but Netlink back in the day, especially with like X-Band, I was very familiar with the X-Band, but nobody had it. Like, none of my friends had it. I didn't have it. My parents didn't want to pay for the monthly fee for it. So it was one of those things that we all thought was really neat, but nobody really had it to try it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and I was in the same boat. I actually finally got Sega Rally Netlink running just a few months ago. And, what a joy it was for me to be able to see a 2-player game with each player having its own screen. Mm. And the way I got my setup going is I had, a telephone line simulator that I employed. And so I was able to get 2 TVs, 2 Saturns, 2 copies of Sega Rally Netlink, all running in the same room. And so it was essentially like a 2-player battle, but everybody had their own full screen, and it was what a joy. It was just so phenomenal, and the fact that this setup can still work today is to me just amazing. It was so far ahead of its time, and it remains. It's just yet another sort of charm to the game, in its long list of charms. Just a couple of quick release notes on Sega Rally Netlink Edition. It was only available as part of the Netlink game pack, so that was like a big giant cardboard box that came with Sega Rally Netlink and Virtual On Netlink, and they both came in standard jewel cases inside this box set. You couldn't buy them separately, and so they didn't have any sort of long box retail releases in that way. But yeah, it was almost like Sega Rally plus plus is how I would see it. It added a few extra options and little bits of graphics and things like that to really spice up the original Sega Rally release, and then the Netlink capability really just kind of makes it the cream of the crop. So to me it's the definitive edition, but I don't want people to get hung up either on thinking that they must get the Netlink edition of Sega Rally, which is much more uncommon than the vanilla Sega Rally edition. You're not going to be missing out on any huge chunks of content by going for the vanilla edition.
Very correct. The vanilla edition is for sure still very good. You're just fine playing that one.
Definitely. And again, I'm just trying to think from memory of any other sort of differences. In vanilla Sega Rally on the Saturn, a lot of the trackside spectators are static sprites, whereas in the Netlink edition, a few of them are actually animated. So it's these kinds of changes that I'm talking about. And by animated, like they're clapping or they're waving their hands or whatever. So it's just very, very minor details like that were not put into the game in time for its North American release, but did subsequently make it into the Japanese and other editions. And so this was a way to bring those changes into the North American market.
Anybody was able to make it to the PRGE, the last one that we did, and to the Sega Room, the Saturn Lounge. We actually had a Netlink edition running on 2 of the monitors, so you could race each other on that. And so we had a running version there.
I cannot wait to go to PRG in subsequent years. Hopefully the Canadian dollar will do a little bit better. Right now it's sort of tanking against the US dollar. It makes things a little bit tough, but yeah, that's definitely something that I would absolutely look forward to going back to and doing.
Hopefully I don't get COVID again.
Oh, yeah, that sucks so bad. Nick, for all you guys that are listening, Nick was supposed to be there, and up to the last minute, he was like, "Yeah, I can't wait to see you guys." And then he drops the bombshell, "Crap, I got COVID," and so we were like, "Oh."
It was the day before I was supposed to leave, and it was on my birthday. Worst present ever. Year 28 didn't start out super great, so that was a bummer. For the record, everybody. I like to make a correction. Sega Rally Netlink came out in 1997, late 97. I was potty trained by then.
Oh my God.
Just to clear the air.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All of Saturndom is forever enriched with this knowledge.
Oh, I love it. I love it. This is how you know how old you are. If you're like, "Oh my goodness, Nick was potty trained."
I was. And so are you guys. It's like, yeah, we're all on the same page, right?
Right.
We're all just fine. Yeah.
Okay, as we look to wrap up, do you guys have anything that you want to specifically call out?
Yeah, just that if you're just now getting into the Saturn, these 3 games are great places to start. You will not go wrong starting with any of these. Maybe I would, if you can't get a light gun, maybe start with Rally or VF2 instead of Virtua Cop. But other than that, you really can't go wrong with these 3.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Nick on that completely. These are three games that are great to start out on the Saturn with. And depending on where you are, like you said with the light gun, if you don't have light gun support, either a CRT or can't get that, try one of the other two. If you have a second controller, for example, and a second player, then going with Virtua Fighter 2 may be the good way to go first because you can both play at the same time. Whereas with, say, for like Virtua Rally, while you can do a two-player split screen, it's just a different experience completely there as well. So, yeah, you just really can't go wrong either way. It's definitely a good place to start with your Saturn collection.
All right, so to finish off, we want to just give a shout out to our patrons. So first off, our VIP patrons, A Murder of Crows, Blue Moon 95, Emerald Nova, Ioannis Fetz, and Nate Lawrence. And also our All Access patrons, Ceralian, Chris1997XX, Derek Pascarella, Fat Drunk Friend Otaku, Jen Clash or Rank, Ian Keg, Justin, Mamdou Madwar, Normal Guy, Nutrageous, Robert Ramsey, Rowan Dinch, Sega Steve, Stoneman, Tanuki Trev, Theron Brown, and Young Money Sway. Folks, thank you so much for your support. It means the world to us, and it really helps us to make everything that we do possible. The end of 1995 was a pivotal time for the Saturn's fortunes in the West. With the PlayStation gaining steam, the Ultra 64, looming on the horizon, and this growing malaise that the Saturn just wasn't cut out to compete with its rivals, Sega needed a way to remind gamers that it was a premier world-class player in the industry, and that they should not be taken lightly. And with these successive releases of Virtua Cop, SEGA Rally, and Virtua Fighter 2, they did just that. These ended up being not only top-tier Saturn games, but also world-class video game experiences that Sega's rivals didn't end up equaling that holiday season, or indeed in the months to follow. Unfortunately, brilliant as they were, by then it felt like nothing could stop the meteoric rise of the PlayStation juggernaut. But in a way, Sony's success surely spurred Sega to pump out the very best games possible to compete. And of course, it was all of us Saturn fans that benefited. And we continue to benefit to this day. On behalf of all of us here at the Sega Saturn SHIRO podcast, thanks for tuning in. And remember, you must play Sega Saturn.
It's their turn to play, and here we go.
Yep. If you had the gun, you were doing better, for sure.
See, and that's so weird. So I didn't play the game with the gun initially for years and years because, believe it or not, up here in Canada, the guns were banned. So you couldn't buy Virtua Cop with the guns because you've got some pretty strict anti-gun laws. So we just couldn't do it.
Dude, I didn't know this. That's crazy.
I'm totally kidding.
Oh my God, you had me going. Stop it. I was like, why did I not hear about this? 4.5 hours. Oh man.
I'll probably cut this out. It'll go into our funny outtakes, but yeah, no.
I love it. That was great.
Oh man.
I just figured, with the Canada thing, I'm bound to get you guys. So
You got it. You got me. You and your Kit Kats. God.